Hey, everybody. I'm Chris Metzler, Director of Programming here at SF Indie Fest. Um, with all these different films you've been seeing, we've been celebrating 25 years of bringing kind of some of the most interesting, unusual, and cool independent films from around the world. And you're joining me here for our closing night film, our closing night documentary. This is National Wake. You've just had a chance to see this really awesome film, and we're lucky enough to have filmmaker Marissa Neff here. Welcome, Marissa.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
And word on the street is you used to live in the Bay Area and we're kind of near some of your old haunts.
Yes, I lived in the Bay for 16 years actually, from 1996 to 2012. So I spent a long stretch of my life there and miss it a lot. And I'm psyched to bring the film back to Indie Fest.
Absolutely. Well, very cool. This was just kind of a really neat film to kind of run into in submissions. And I wonder, one of the questions I imagine some of our viewers and audience might have is just like, how did you kind of stumble upon this story and know that this was kind of there was a film here to be made and you wanted to go down the rabbit hole?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, I found out about National Wake through another documentary called Punk in Africa. That's about the idiom of punk in Southern Africa. And they were one of, many bands that were featured in that film. And, but I was completely struck by their music and the footage, this Super 8 footage that was shot of them by actually my film's co-producer, Nadine Katie, as well as another photographer, Robin Muir, and it just blew me away. I was, I'm a kid of the 80s. I grew up with like this kind of cursory, naive knowledge of what was happening in South Africa at that time. But when I saw this footage of this multiracial band getting up on stage in the middle of apartheid, rocking out, and their fans coming together, of, all different colors coming together and dancing and flirting and just getting down on the dance floor to National Wake, I was just like, whoa, this is something really interesting, obviously. So I got in touch with Ivan Katie, who's the main protagonist of the film, and he was living in LA. And I flew out to LA to interview him for a public radio piece, actually, for this program, The World. And during that conversation, during that interview, I found out that National Wake's album was about to be re-released on this label called Light in the Attic later that year. That was 2013. So it's been a long process, actually. I had no intentions of making a feature documentary at the time. The rabbit hole, yeah, just kind of happened, I would say. It wasn't something that I was intent on to begin with. I was working on a PBS show called Soundtracks that was actually based out of the Bay, kind of associated with the J School at Berkeley, and folks that worked on Frontline World there created this show along with Marco Werman of The World, that was about the intersection of music and politics. And I imagine it was like a news magazine style show, kind of like the 60 minutes of music, so to speak. And yeah, I imagine this being a segment for that show. So like a 15-minute segment for that show where I would be on camera interviewing people and kind of nodding along empathetically and stuff. And once I started delving into the story, I realized that it was much more nuanced. There was much more to convey than a 15-minute TV segment could do. And that's kind of when it occurred to me that I might be in it for the long haul.
Well, I think it turned out really great, and it's interesting how documentaries beget other documentaries, or journalistic stories beget larger stories of kind of all these different kind of untold stories that are out there in the world to be discovered. Once you knew that this was going to be a documentary, how did you you knew that like one of the visual kind of aesthetics was going to be this Super 8 archival footage, but like, how did you go? What was the kind of point of view or kind of visual storytelling approach you wanted to do in the sense of like, telling the story from, almost 40 or 50 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it was kind of a long road to figure out how I wanted to depict this story. This is my first film. So I kind of was going along initially with a kind of template that I thought I had to do for a kind of quote unquote rock doc, and
Mm.
was filming interviews and imagined, using talking heads. And in the end, there are no talking heads in the film, actually. And part of that was just wanting this footage to really sing, and for people who are watching the film to really experience that footage and feel like they're kind of there with the band. But it was a process of kind of giving myself permission to find the aesthetic that I thought most made sense, because it was my first film. So I kind of had to find my own voice through that process.
And as you kind of talk to different people, how had there like what were kind of some of the biggest surprises that you had, that people shared with you, either about those times or their reflections back on those times?
I mean, I would say the biggest surprise, honestly, is just that this band was able to exist, that they were able to that there were cracks that they were able to exploit. Because in my mind, from what I learned in elementary school, which I said was very, unnuanced, and I imagined that blacks and whites in South Africa at that time were completely separate, that there was no mixing whatsoever. And, of course, in practice, that's not possible. Like there's a small white, power structure that needed this black, you know, population to be nearby, to be able to be the workforce, to drive the industry, to work in mines, to work in people's homes, to work in, tend to to the, white folks' gardens and that kind of thing. So they essentially structured, constructed Soweto, the Southwest townships, to have the black population close enough to Johannesburg, but not, you know, but far enough away as well. So just to see that, this band, I don't know, I guess like one surprising thing, honestly, is this figure, Mike Labisi, who was one of the original members of the band, and how the band was formed was the fact, essentially by dint of the fact that Mike Labisi kind of like, he was this black guy from Soweto who didn't give a shit, pardon my French,
Mhm.
that,
Oh, great.
about like the strictures of the apartheid system. And he lived his life the way that he wanted to. And he kind of would, befriended people from these kind of like more liberal, like white, university enclaves, and wandered into the house of Ivan Katie. And one day, I think he'd already befriended somebody in the house, so it wasn't totally out of the blue, but he, then struck up this friendship with Ivan and started jamming with him. And Ivan mentioned that he wanted to start a band. And Mike was like, "Oh, I know two guys from Soweto, two black guys, these brothers, Gary and Punkakoza. Why don't I bring them over to jam?" And it's like, okay, like I think within one of the shocking things, honestly, to me, is that, that this band came together in an as organic a way as possible within that, very, dastardly environment. So I think that was one of the real surprises, like how it came together, and that it was kind of as pure and, based on the love for artistry and music, and rather than a kind of top down, okay, we're going to create this multiracial band that's going to make a statement. That was, not actually how National Wake came together. And in that, I think they were very singular. There were other multiracial bands, not necessarily rock bands, but, kind of almost like statement bands that were trying to, make a statement and take a stand in their way, which was admirable. But National Wake was a different thing.
That's cool. It's neat to kind of think about just the serendipity involved, and then maybe it's also one of the reasons why their music struck you as so genuine and catchy when you saw the Punk in Africa documentary.
Yeah, no, I would say that's definitely true.
Um, have you had a chance to kind of screen the film in South Africa yet, and or for members of the band, like what's their response been?
Yeah, essentially, it has not screened in South Africa yet, and that's kind of at the top of my list. It's of vital importance to bring it back to South Africa, because I spent so much time there. They're making it. So I can't wait to do that. So like, Gary and Punka's family, like for instance, they haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
But the film premiered at Sheffield DocFest in June. And Ivan Katie came to that screening. Nadine Katie, who's Ivan's wife, but like I say, she was co-producer on the film. She was very much a part of National Wake Story. She shot a bunch of the footage and stuff. Um, Vivian Koza, Gary's widow, she lives in the UK, so it was easy for her to come. Gary's kids, Sean and Shaky Koza, they came to the screening as well. It was extremely emotional for all of these folks. And I think, but also, I think very cathartic, especially for the kids, because his presence, he wasn't in their lives for that long. So I think that it was just incredible to see this footage. For instance, there's footage of him toward the end of the film, and that's from the end of his life, really, of Gary playing piano. And it was also, just to go off on a tangent, it was of vital importance for me to try to amplify the voices, the Black voices in this film, of the deceased Black band members, because Gary and Punka died years before I started making the film. And, so I tried to do that through interviewing, their kind of proteges and their friends from Soweto that kind of joined them in the National Wake House and were part of the scene. And so that was one way. We do hear them through the music. And at a certain point, we hear Punka on some audio from an interview that he did in Ireland, many years after National Wake ended. We never hear Gary's voice actually outside of the music, but there is this footage of him playing piano essentially months before he died, that was shot by a filmmaker in Johannesburg, Lungalom Tambo, who had planned on making a film just about Gary. And he, and that didn't happen. That film didn't end up coming to fruition, but he so graciously let me use that footage in this film. And I'm forever grateful to him for that, because I really do feel like we hear Gary's voice through his piano playing.
That's so cool. Do you think, in sharing this film, right? What do you hope? I mean, you made like you said, is like, so just for our audience here, is that so often like music documentaries, it's like so many of them are made for, fans already of a band, and so we kind of call those rock docs in the programming world. And then, and then there's music docs that kind of, they're within the kind of subculture of stories that involve music. And so think you've made like a really kind of timeless story that kind of resonates, whether you are familiar with the band or even like the music. I think there's just a really cool personal story captured there. When, the lights go up in the theater, or, when the credits roll at home, what is it that you think that you might want people to take away from the film, particularly those that might be younger than myself, I guess, of like what, not so much like lesson learned, but like, what do you think is particularly inspiring of this is, the National Wake Story?
Yeah. I mean, I think that what I'd say is most inspiring to me is that they chose to, despite the fact that they were constantly being harassed by the government. And, not only that, I think that so much of like, totalitarian systems and apartheid and was about kind of like mind control and just making people, creating these laws and making, even though there was no way of like constant enforcement, although National Wake was harassed, like toward the end of their tenure, they were being raided like 2-3 times a day. Their house was being raided. But they persevered. And I think that what's so admirable about them is that they, just kind of made a decision to create the world that they wanted to live in within their sanctuary, within the four walls of their house, and create the art that they wanted to create, in the midst of a dystopia, really. So I think that is what I find most admirable about them.
Neat. And I always kind of say, kind of try to remind our audience is that you guys are out there, you're like the street team for the documentaries and narrative films that you see as part of film festivals. And we're lucky enough that, filmmakers allow us as film festivals kind of get a chance to share their film. And so now it's your job to kind of go out there and help spread the word about this great film you just saw. So, Marissa, what's kind of some of the happenings with the film? How can people continue to follow your and the film's efforts, and also just kind of post online about this great film they saw?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the first stop online is thisisnationalwake.com. All of the info about upcoming screenings is there, and you know, social links, etc. So I would say that that is kind of, in some ways, a one-stop shop for anyone who wants to
Nice.
learn more about National Wake or continue to follow the progress of the film.
Very cool. Well, thank you again. A really great film, and everybody, thanks for joining us and being part of SFND Fest. And have a great day.
Thank you, Chris.